David walked down the empty street, his hands deep in his jacket pockets. The night was cold, and the wind howled through the trees. He had trouble sleeping most nights, but walking helped clear his mind. The past still haunted him. Memories of war, lost friends, and the weight of things left undone. As he turned the corner near an old alley, he suddenly stopped. A faint whimper reached his ears. He looked around, scanning the shadows. Then he saw it. A small, thin dog crouched near a pile of trash bags. Its fur was soaked from the rain, and it shivered in the cold. David's heart clenched. He had seen suffering before, but something about this dog felt different. It wasn't just lost. It was broken, just like him. He took a slow step forward. The dog flinched and tried to move away, but its back leg gave out, and it collapsed with a soft whine. "Easy, buddy," David said gently, crouching down. "I won't hurt you." The dog's ribs stuck out under its wet fur. It looked up at him with tired, golden brown eyes. Eyes that held pain, but also something else. Trust. David hesitated. He wasn't looking for a pet. He could barely take care of himself, but he couldn't walk away either. He pulled off his old army jacket and slowly draped it over the dog. The animal didn't fight him. It just lay there, exhausted. "You need help," David murmured. Carefully, he scooped the dog into his arms. It didn't weigh much, too light for its size. The dog didn't struggle. It rested its head against his chest, as if it knew it was safe now. David carried the dog to his truck, gently setting it on the passenger seat. He turned on the heater, hoping the warmth would help. The dog curled up, eyes half closed, but still watching him. "Let's get you checked out," David said as he started the engine. The drive to the vet was quiet, except for the occasional sigh from the dog. David kept glancing at it, wondering where it had come from. Had it been abandoned? Had it been searching for someone? Just like he had been searching for something. Anything to make him feel whole again. When they arrived, the vet, an older woman named Dr. Harris, greeted them with a kind smile. "Found yourself a friend?" she asked. "More like he found me," David said. Dr. Harris examined the dog carefully. "He's underweight but strong," she said. "No broken bones, just some scrapes and exhaustion." David felt relief wash over him. The dog would be okay. Then, as Dr. Harris trimmed the dog's wet fur to check for hidden wounds, David saw something that made his breath catch. A scar, long and jagged, running down the dog's side. David stared, frozen. His heart pounded in his chest. That scar looked familiar. Too familiar. It couldn't be. Could it? David couldn't take his eyes off the scar. His heart pounded as memories rushed back. The sound of gunfire, the heat of the desert, the barking of a small but brave dog. Dr. Harris didn't notice his reaction. She continued checking the dog's wounds. "This scar looks old," she said. "Whatever happened to him, it was a long time ago." David swallowed hard. His hands clenched into fists. It couldn't be. It was just a stray, a lost dog. But deep down, something told him otherwise. Do you think he had an owner?" David asked, his voice tight. Dr. Harris nodded. "He's been through a lot, but he doesn't act like a wild stray. He trusts humans. He was definitely someone's dog." She gently patted the dog's head. "I can check if he has a microchip." David nodded, barely breathing as she took a small scanner and ran it over the dog's back. Beep. A number flashed on the screen. "He's chipped," Dr. Harris said. "I'll look up the records." David watched as she typed the numbers into her computer. Each second felt like an hour. The dog lay still on the table, his tired eyes locked onto David. Then Dr. Harris frowned. "That's strange." "What?" David's voice was barely a whisper. "This record is old. The last registration was years ago." She squinted at the screen. "Military. Overseas." David's chest tightened. His hands felt cold. Military. Overseas. It was impossible. It had to be a coincidence. "What's the name?" David asked, his voice shaking. Dr. Harris turned the screen toward him. The name hit him like a punch to the gut. Ranger. David's legs felt weak. He gripped the edge of the table to steady himself. "No," he whispered, his vision blurred. It can't be." Dr. Harris looked at him with concern. "Do you know this dog?" David swallowed hard. His mind raced back to that terrible day. The explosion, the dust, the screams. Ranger had been hurt. David had been forced to leave him behind. The guilt had never left him. And now, years later, here he was, alive. David took a shaky breath. He reached out a trembling hand and touched the dog's fur. "Ranger," he whispered. The dog's ears perked up. David's throat tightened. It was him. It was Ranger. Dr. Harris looked between them. "David, this dog has been through a lot. He might not remember everything." David nodded slowly. His mind was spinning. How had Ranger survived? How had he ended up here, miles away from where they had last seen each other? But none of that mattered right now. Ranger was here, and David wasn't going to leak him again. He cleared his throat. "What do I do now?" Dr. Harris smiled softly. "If you want, you can take him home. He needs care, food, and rest. And most of all, he needs someone he trusts." David looked at Ranger. The dog was still watching him. Eyes filled with something deep, something almost like recognition. Could they really find their way back to each other? David wasn't sure. But he knew one thing. He wasn't walking away this time. David carried Ranger to his truck, his mind racing. He still couldn't believe it. After all these years, Ranger was alive. The drive home was quiet. Ranger lay curled up on the seat, his eyes half closed. He looked exhausted but calm, as if he knew he was safe. David glanced at him. "Do you remember me, boy?" he asked softly. Ranger didn't move, but his ears twitched slightly. David sighed. Maybe it was too much to hope for. Ranger had been through so much. Maybe he had forgotten. Maybe time had erased everything. But David couldn't forget. As he drove through the dark streets, his mind drifted back to the past. He remembered the first time he met Ranger. It had been a hot day in the desert. His unit had been assigned a small bomb-sniffing dog, a scrappy golden-brown pup with sharp eyes and boundless energy. They named him Ranger. At first, David hadn't thought much of the little dog. But Ranger proved himself quickly. He was smart, fearless, and loyal. He saved their lives more times than David could count. Then came the worst day of David's life. An explosion. Chaos. Ranger had been injured. There had been no time, no way to save him. David had been forced to leave him behind. The guilt had never left him. And now, against all odds, Ranger was here. David pulled into his driveway and turned off the engine. He sat for a moment, staring at his old house. It was small and quiet, just the way he liked it. But now, for the first time in years, he wasn't alone. He reached over and gently touched Ranger's head. "Come on, buddy. Let's go home." Ranger lifted his head and looked at him. For a second, something flickered in his eyes, something familiar. David's heart ached. Maybe he did remember. Slowly, he helped Ranger out of the truck and carried him inside. He set him down on a soft blanket in the living room. Ranger stretched out with a tired sigh. "You're safe now," David whispered. The next morning, David woke up to a strange feeling. Something warm pressed against his leg. He looked down. Ranger had curled up beside him during the night. David smiled. It was the first real smile he had in a long time. He reached out and scratched Ranger's ears. "You always did like sneaking onto my bed," he murmured. Ranger let out a soft huff and closed his eyes again. David got up and made breakfast, cooking an extra portion for Ranger. As he set down a bowl of food, he hesitated. Would Ranger still remember old commands? There was only one way to find out. David stood up straight. He took a deep breath and said, "Ranger, sit." Ranger's ears perked up. He blinked a few times, then slowly sat down. David's breath caught in his throat. "Ranger, stay," he said. Ranger didn't move. David swallowed hard. His heart pounded. "Ranger, come." Ranger stood up and walked toward him. David dropped to his knees, his vision blurring. He wrapped his arms around Ranger, holding him tight. "You do remember," he whispered. Ranger let out a small whine and nuzzled into him. David closed his eyes. For the first time in years, the weight in his chest lifted. Ranger was home, and so was he. David sat on the floor, his arms still wrapped around Ranger. His heart pounded. His chest felt tight, but this time, it wasn't from pain. It was something else, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Ranger leaned against him, his warm body pressing into David's chest. He let out a deep sigh, as if he had finally found where he belonged. David pulled back slightly and looked into Ranger's eyes. "How did you survive?" he whispered. "How did you make it back?" Ranger blinked slowly, his golden brown eyes full of something deep, something David couldn't quite put into words. David sat back and rubbed his face. His mind was spinning. It had been years. Ranger had been left behind in a war zone. The chances of him making it out alive, let alone ending up in the same small town as David, were impossible. And yet, here he was. David took a deep breath and grabbed his phone. He needed answers. He called Dr. Harris. She picked up on the second ring. "David?" "Doc, I need to know everything about Ranger's records," he said. "Where has he been all these years?" Dr. Harris sighed. "I did some digging after you left," she said. "Ranger's last recorded location was overseas, but after that, there's a gap. No records, no updates. Then, about a year ago, he was registered at an animal shelter in another state." David frowned. "A shelter?" "Yes," Dr. Harris said. "Someone must have found him and brought him back to the U.S., but there's no name, no details on who rescued him." David ran a hand through his hair. "So he's been moving from place to place." "Looks like it," Dr. Harris said, "until he ended up here." David looked at Ranger, who was now resting his head on his paws, watching him carefully. It didn't matter how he got here. What mattered was that he was here now. "Thanks, Doc," David said. "Take good care of him," Dr. Harris said gently. David hung up and set his phone down. He reached out and stroked Ranger's back, his fingers brushing over the scar. "This scar," he murmured. "I remember when you got it." The memory hit him like a wave. A dusty road, a loud explosion, Ranger's small body flying through the air. David had thought he was gone. But then, against all odds, Ranger had gotten back up, wounded but still standing, still fighting. And now, here he was, years later, still standing, still fighting. David swallowed hard. "You never gave up, did you, boy?" Ranger's tail thumped softly against the floor. David let out a shaky breath. "All right," he said. "If you can keep going, so can I." For the first time in years, he felt like he wasn't alone. That night, David set up a proper bed for Ranger, but once again, he woke up to find the dog curled up beside him. He smiled and shook his head. "Guess some things never change," he muttered. Over the next few days, David and Ranger fell into a routine. They took long walks together, just like they used to in the military. David spoke softly to him, telling him stories he had never told anyone else. And every time David gave a command, Ranger responded, without hesitation, without doubt. It was as if no time had passed. It was as if they had never been apart. David looked at him one morning and smiled. "Yeah," he said quietly. "It's really you." Ranger wagged his tail. For the first time in a long time, David felt whole again. Ranger was home. And so was he. The days passed, and something inside David began to change. He still woke up in the middle of the night sometimes, gasping for air, heart racing from nightmares of the past. But now, when he opened his eyes, Ranger was there. The dog would lift his head, ears perked up, watching him carefully. Then, as if sensing David's pain, Ranger would scoot closer and press his warm body against him. David would take slow, deep breaths, running his hand through Ranger's fur. And just like that, the darkness would fade. "You always knew how to keep me steady, huh, boy?" David murmured one night, scratching behind Ranger's ears. The dog let out a soft sigh and rested his head on David's chest. It had been so long since David had felt this kind of peace. During the day, they took long walks together, exploring the quiet streets of David's small town. Ranger walked beside him, just like he used to, alert, steady, always watching. One afternoon, David decided to test something. They were at a quiet park, away from the roads. He took a deep breath and said, "Ranger, heel." Without hesitation, Ranger moved to his side, walking perfectly in step. David's chest tightened. "Sit." Ranger sat. David stared at him, his throat thick with emotion. It wasn't just muscle memory. It wasn't just a well-trained dog obeying commands. Ranger remembered. "You really are my Ranger," David whispered. Ranger wagged his tail and let out a short bark, as if to say, "Of course I am." David knelt down and ran his hands over Ranger's head. "I thought I lost you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Ranger licked his hand and leaned into him. David closed his eyes. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. But not everyone in town was as welcoming. One afternoon, while walking past a cafe, a man frowned at them. "Is that a stray?" he asked. David tensed. "He's mine." "He looks rough," the man muttered. "Some dogs are dangerous, you know." David clenched his jaw. He looked down at Ranger, who stood calmly by his side, his tail wagging slightly. "This dog saved lives," David said firmly. "He's not dangerous." The man scoffed and walked away. David let out a slow breath. He looked at Ranger. "People don't know what you've been through, buddy," he said. Ranger just wagged his tail. David smiled. "Come on, let's go home." That night, as they sat on the porch, David looked down at his furry companion. "I used to think I didn't belong anywhere," he admitted. "After the war, after everything, I just felt lost." Ranger looked up at him, ears twitching. David chuckled softly. "But then you found me." Ranger nudged his hand, and David ran his fingers through his fur. "Maybe we were both lost," David murmured. "But now, we're home." Ranger let out a soft huff and rested his head on David's knee. David stared up at the stars, a sense of peace washing over him. He didn't know what the future held. But for the first time, in a long time, he wasn't afraid to face it, because he wasn't alone anymore. He had Ranger. And that was enough. David never thought he would feel normal again. For years, he had lived in silence, keeping the world at a distance. But now, with Ranger by his side, something inside him was changing. Each morning, he woke up to the sound of soft breathing beside him. Ranger would stretch, yawn, and nudge David's arm, ready for the day. All right, David chuckled one morning. "I get it. Breakfast first." Ranger wagged his tail, following him to the kitchen. David poured himself a cup of coffee and filled Ranger's bowl with food. As he watched Ranger eat, he felt something strange, something he hadn't felt in years. Contentment. After breakfast, they went for their usual walk. The air was crisp, and the sun was just beginning to rise. David inhaled deeply, feeling a peace he hadn't known in a long time. Ranger walked beside him, always alert. It reminded David of their time overseas. Ranger had always been his shadow, watching his every move, making sure he was safe. "You still got my back, huh?" David murmured. Ranger looked up at him, tail wagging. As they passed the town's small market, a familiar voice called out, "David, is that your dog?" David turned to see Mrs. Jenkins, the kind old woman who owned the local bakery. She stood outside her shop, a warm smile on her face. "Yes, ma'am," David said, patting Ranger's head. She stepped closer, looking at Ranger with gentle eyes. "He's a handsome boy." "He's more than that," David said. "He's my best friend." Mrs. Jenkins smiled. "It's good to see you with someone, David. You always seemed so lonely." David glanced at Ranger. "Not anymore." They chatted for a few minutes before Mrs. Jenkins disappeared into her shop. David and Ranger continued walking, but something about what she said stuck with him. He really had been lonely before, and he hadn't even realized how much until Ranger came back. Later that afternoon, David decided to test something. He took Ranger to an open field outside of town. He hadn't tried any serious training since they had reunited, but he wanted to see if Ranger still had it in him. David took a deep breath. "Ranger, stay." Ranger froze in place, eyes locked on David. David took a few steps back. "Ranger, come." Ranger sprinted toward him without hesitation, stopping perfectly in front of him. David smiled. "Good boy." He knelt down, running his hands over Ranger's fur. "You never forgot, did you?" Ranger licked his hand. David sighed. He had spent so many years thinking about the past, about everything he had lost. But now, with Ranger, he realized something important. Not everything had been lost. Some things, the most important things, had found their way back. That night, David sat on the porch, Ranger lying beside him. The stars stretched across the sky, and the night air was cool. "You know," David said, rubbing Ranger's back, "I think you saved me, buddy." Ranger let out a soft sigh and rested his head on David's lap. David smiled. For the first time in years, he wasn't just surviving. He was living. And it was all because of Ranger. David woke up before sunrise. He stretched and sat up, feeling something warm and familiar beside him. Ranger was curled up on the bed, his head resting on David's leg. David chuckled softly. "You really don't like sleeping alone, do you, buddy?" Ranger's tail thumped against the blanket, but he didn't open his eyes. David rubbed his head and stood up. The house felt different these days, warmer, more alive. For years, the silence had been heavy. Now, it was filled with the soft sound of paws following him, the jingle of a collar, and the comforting presence of his best friend. After breakfast, they went for their usual walk. The town was waking up, and a few familiar faces waved as they passed. David noticed something today that he hadn't before. People smiled when they saw him. Not in pity, not in awkwardness, just simple, friendly smiles. He had spent so much time keeping to himself, shutting the world out. But now, with Ranger by his side, things felt different. As they walked past the local park, David saw a man sitting alone on a bench. He looked down, lost in thought, his shoulders hunched. A service dog vest rested beside him. David hesitated for a moment before walking over. "Hey," he said, "mind if we sit?" The man glanced up, surprised. He looked at Ranger and gave a small nod. "Sure." David sat beside him. Ranger sat at his feet, watching them both. "You a vet?" David asked. The man nodded. "Yeah. Army." David nodded too. "Same here." They sat in silence for a moment. Finally, the man sighed. "I lost my service dog last month," he said quietly. "Had him for years. I don't know how to move forward without him." David swallowed. He knew that pain. "I get it," he said. "It's not just losing a pet. It's losing a part of yourself." The man nodded. "Exactly." David looked at Ranger, who was watching the man carefully, his ears tilted forward as if he understood. After a moment, David spoke. "I thought I lost mine too." He reached down and scratched Ranger's ears. Years ago, and somehow, against all odds, he found his way back. The man looked at Ranger. "He was your service dog?" David nodded. "More than that. He was my partner." The man reached out hesitantly, and Ranger sniffed his hand before giving it a small lick. A tiny smile flickered across the man's face. "He's a good one," he said. "The best," David agreed. They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Then the man cleared his throat. "You know what," he said, "I've been thinking about getting another dog. But I don't know if I'm ready." David looked at him. "I didn't think I was either." The man met his gaze. "But sometimes," David continued, "the right dog finds you when you need them the most." The man nodded slowly, as if letting the words settle in. David stood and patted Ranger's back. "Take your time," he said, "but don't shut yourself off. A good dog doesn't replace the one you lost, but they do help heal the parts of you that are broken." The man gave a small, grateful smile. David and Ranger walked away, but something in David's heart felt lighter. Maybe he hadn't just been saved. Maybe he could help save others too. And for the first time in a long time, he had a purpose again. Ranger wagged his tail as if he knew. And maybe he did. David sat on his porch, staring out at the quiet street. The sun was setting, casting golden light over the houses. Ranger lay beside him, his head resting on David's boot. For the first time in years, David felt at peace. Not just because Ranger was back, but because he finally understood something. He wasn't alone. He had spent so much time pushing the world away, convinced that no one could understand the weight he carried. But Ranger had never left his side, and somehow, against all odds, life had given them a second chance. David reached down and scratched Ranger's ears. "Guess we both got lucky, huh?" Ranger wagged his tail, letting out a small huff of agreement. A knock on the fence made David look up. He turned to see the man from the park, the one who had lost his service dog, standing there with a hesitant smile. "Hey," the man said. "Mind if I sit?" David nodded and gestured to the chair beside him. The man settled in and took a deep breath. "I wanted to say thanks," he said, "for the other day. What you said, it stuck with me." David glanced at him. "Yeah." The man smiled. "Yeah, I went to a shelter yesterday. Met a dog named Scout. He's not my old partner, but," his voice softened, "he's a good dog, and I think he needs me as much as I need him." David felt a lump in his throat. He looked down at Ranger, who was watching them both, ears perked up. "That's how it works," David said. "Sometimes the right dog finds you." The man nodded. "I think you're right." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sky turn from gold to deep blue. After a while, the man cleared his throat. "I run a program for vets," he said. "We train service dogs for guys like us. Helps them adjust back to normal life." David raised an eyebrow. "Sounds like important work." "It is," the man said. He hesitated. "And we could use someone like you." David blinked. "Me?" "You've got the experience," the man said. "You understand the bond between a soldier and his dog. You know what it's like to heal." He nodded toward Ranger. "And you've got a pretty great partner." David looked at Ranger. The dog who had been with him in the worst moments of his life. The dog who had found his way back, even when the world had tried to tear them apart. The dog who had saved him, not just once, but over and over again. David took a slow breath. For years, he had felt lost, like his life had no purpose outside of the past. But now, maybe, just maybe, he had found his way forward. He looked back at the man and nodded. "I'm in." The man grinned. "Good. I had a feeling you'd say that." As he stood to leave, David watched him go, a small smile playing at his lips. Ranger nudged his hand, and David chuckled. "Looks like we've got work to do, buddy." Ranger wagged his tail, ready for whatever came next. David leaned back in his chair, looking up at the sky. For the first time in a long time, the future didn't feel scary. It felt hopeful. And as long as Ranger was by his side, he knew everything was going to be okay. Because they had been given a second chance, and they weren't going to waste it.